There is a moment in the late summer of 1944 when the war in France could have ended differently. Not slightly differently, fundamentally differently. The kind of differently that changes casualty lists, rewrites campaign histories, and brings men home months before they actually came home. That moment existed. It was real. The conditions for it had been created by one of the most effective corps commanders the United States Army produced in the entire war. The breakthrough had been executed. The enemy was broken. The road east was open in a way it would never be open again. And then the telephone rang. On the other end was Omar Bradley, and what he said in that conversation, the order he gave, the reasoning he offered, the decision he made from a headquarters that was not within 50 miles of the fighting, would echo forward through the autumn of 1944 and into the winter, through forests and frozen roads and casualty figures that did not have to be that high. The man who received that order was Wade Haislip. You have probably never heard of him. That absence from your knowledge is not an accident. It is, in a very precise sense, the subject of what follows. The United States Army in 1944 had a clear institutional hierarchy for how glory was distributed. Army commanders received credit for campaigns. Corps commanders executed the movements those campaigns required. Division commanders did the fighting. This was not merely protocol, it was the structural logic of an organization that needed to present its achievements to the American public in comprehensible terms. The public could name Eisenhower, they could name Patton. They could hold on to Bradley as the GI general, the quiet face of competent leadership. A corps commander was, in this architecture, a mechanism. He was important the way a gear is important, essential to the machine, invisible to anyone not studying the engineering. Wade Haislip commanded the 15th Corps under Patton's Third Army. He was not invisible to Patton. Patton watched his corps commanders with the particular attention of a man who understood that his own reputation was only as good as the men who executed his intentions. And what Patton saw in Haislip, consistently, over months of the most demanding mobile warfare the American Army had conducted since the Civil War, was a commander who understood speed the way Patton himself understood it, not as a tactical option, but as a moral imperative, a weapon in itself, the thing that turned a victory into a collapse. What the system had not designed for was a corps commander who was, in the summer of 1944, outperforming every expectation the institutional hierarchy had built around his rank. Haislip was not supposed to matter this much. The system had not written that part for him. He mattered anyway. Operation Cobra launched on the 25th of July, 1944. Its objective was to rupture the German lines in Normandy that had held the Allied armies in the hedgerow country for nearly 2 months. The planning was Bradley's. The execution was Collins' 7th Corps on the left, and the growing momentum of Patton's forces as they swept south and east through the gap the breakout had torn. By early August, the situation had transformed beyond what any Allied planner had formally projected. The official expectation for the post-breakout phase was measured advance, consolidation of gains, maintenance of supply lines. The system existed because armies that advance faster than their logistics can follow tend to stall, become isolated, and die. The doctrine was not invented arbitrarily. It was written in the blood of commanders who had learned the hard way that a brilliant advance with empty fuel tanks is just a different kind of disaster. But the German army in France in August 1944 was not the German army of 1940 or 1941. It had been bled for 4 years on the Eastern Front. It had been starved of fuel and armor by Allied air supremacy. The formations that faced Haislip's 15th Corps as it drove south through Brittany and then swung east were not conducting an organized defense. They were attempting to survive a collapse that had already begun.
The gap between what doctrine prescribed and what the ground actually demanded had never been wider. Haislip understood this. He drove his corps with a controlled aggression that Patton described in his diary in terms that were, for Patton, unusually warm. The 15th Corps moved. It moved at a pace that German commanders in their after-action reports would later describe as the primary reason their defensive efforts failed. Not because American firepower was overwhelming, but because there was never enough time to establish a position before the Americans were already past it.
By the 11th of August, 1944, the strategic situation in northern France had produced something that military historians would later describe as a once-in-a-campaign opportunity. Haislip's 15th Corps had driven north from Le Mans toward Argentan at a speed that had outpaced not just the German defenders, but the comprehension of the Allied headquarters trying to track it. At the same time, Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen toward Falaise. Between the two forces, between Haislip to the south and the Canadians to the north, was the bulk of two German armies, the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army. Hundreds of thousands of men. The headquarters staffs, the experienced cadres, the organizational infrastructure of Germany's entire Western military establishment. The distance between Haislip's lead elements and the Canadian advance was 20 miles. 20 miles, and two German armies would be encircled. Two German armies would be destroyed, not defeated, not forced to retreat and reconstitute. Destroyed, their men captured or killed, their equipment abandoned, their organizational capacity eliminated so completely that the road to Germany itself would open before an Allied force that had just broken the last coherent enemy formation in France. Patton saw it. Haislip saw it. The men of 15th Corps, exhausted and fuel-hungry and running on the particular adrenaline of men who know they are winning, were pushing north with everything they had. What would you choose if you were the man on the ground? If you could see the gap between your lead elements and the Canadians closing in real time, and you understood with the absolute clarity of a commander who had been watching this enemy crack for 3 weeks that the window was measured in hours, Haislip chose to push.
Bradley halted Haislip at Argentan. The order came on the 13th of August. Haislip's 15th Corps was directed to stop its northward advance and hold its position. The official justification was boundary coordination. The inter-allied boundary between American and British-Canadian forces ran through the Falaise-Argentan area, and Bradley was concerned about the risk of American forces advancing into sectors designated for Canadian operations, with the attendant danger of friendly fire incidents between converging columns. This reason was not without validity. Inter-allied boundary violations were a genuine operational hazard. Friendly fire incidents between converging forces had occurred before and would occur again. The system that established and enforced these boundaries existed because the alternative, multiple national forces converging on the same ground without coordination, created chaos that could be as lethal as enemy action. But the Canadians were not moving fast enough to close the gap from the north. This was known at Bradley's headquarters. It was known at Seine. The Canadian advance from Caen had been grinding, costly, and slower than projected. The gap between the Canadian lead elements and Argentan was not 20 miles, it was larger, and it was not closing at a rate that matched the urgency of the opportunity. Bradley later wrote that he preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise. The phrase was elegant. It was the kind of thing a careful commander says when he wants to explain why he chose certainty over possibility. What it did not explain was why a corps that had demonstrated for 3 weeks precisely the kind of controlled aggression required to close that gap quickly was being held in place while the gap remained open. Haislip received the order. He was, by every account, incredulous. His staff was incredulous. Patton was furious. He called Bradley and asked, with the particular edge he reserved for conversations he was recording in his diary, whether XV Corps should continue and drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. Bradley told him, in words Patton noted verbatim, "Seriously, just stop where you are and build up on that shoulder." The Germans moved through the gap for 2 more days. If you have made it this far, what follows is the part that connects August 1944 to everything that came after. Because the soldiers and commanders who escaped through the Falaise Gap did not disappear. They did not cease to be a military problem. They crossed the Seine. They reorganized east of the river. They were reconstituted, partially rearmed, and returned to the line. And in December 1944, some of the experienced cadres from those formations, men who had marched through the gap that Haislip had been ordered not to close, were part of the force that struck the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was not caused solely by the failure to close the Falaise Gap. The relationship between the two events is complex, and historians who draw direct causal lines do so at the risk of oversimplification. But the relationship is real. The experienced headquarters staffs that escaped through the gap, the organizational infrastructure of formations that should have been destroyed in August, contributed to Germany's capacity to plan and execute an offensive in December that cost the American army approximately 75,000 casualties. That is not abstract. Those are men who did not come home in the autumn of 1944 when they might have, because a decision made in August gave Germany the organizational capacity to keep fighting through the winter. Haislip knew this. Patton knew this. They did not say it publicly in terms that contradicted the official account. They understood the system they were operating inside, and they understood what happened to commanders who publicly contested decisions made by men above them in the chain of command. But Patton wrote it in his diary, and the diary did not lie.
Bradley's memoirs addressed the Falaise decision directly. He acknowledged it as controversial. He maintained, across 2 memoirs and decades of public commentary, that the decision to halt at Argentan was correct, that the risk of inter-allied boundary confusion outweighed the potential benefit of closing the gap before the Canadians arrived, and that the German forces that escaped were less significant than the solid defensive line his decision had preserved. The problem with that argument is the documentary record. The German units that escaped through the Falaise Gap were not insignificant remnants. They were the organizational cores of 2 armies. German after-action assessments, compiled in the years after the war from the records of commanders who had been there, described the escape through the Falaise Gap as the single event that preserved Germany's capacity to conduct organized resistance on the Western Front through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. Bradley's account of the decision evolved across his 2 memoirs in ways that historians have noted are difficult to reconcile with the primary sources. In A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, the halt order is presented as a measured, rational response to a genuine operational hazard. In A General's Life, published after his death in 1983, the account is more combative, more defensive in the precise sense of a man defending a decision he knows has been questioned. The evolution of the justification across 40 years is itself a form of evidence. What does not evolve across any version of the account is any acknowledgement of what Haislip's 15th Corps had achieved, or what it might have achieved if the order had not come. The corps that had driven from Le Mans to Argentan in 3 days, one of the most remarkable sustained advances of the entire Western campaign, occupies in Bradley's memoirs approximately the same space it occupied in the official communiques: mechanism, gear, invisible engineering.
The cruelest dimension of the Falaise decision is not what it cost in August 1944.
It is what it reveals about the standard Bradley applied when evaluating his commanders. Because Bradley's relief decisions during the same period of the war were not governed by results, they were governed by fit, by whether a commander matched the institutional mold, by whether he was, in Bradley's own words, judicious, reasonable, and likable. Terry Allen had been the finest division commander in the Mediterranean and was relieved in Sicily. Haislip had driven further, faster, against a collapsing enemy than any corps commander on the Western Front, and then been halted at the moment of maximum opportunity. Charles Corlett, who commanded the 19th Corps and brought irreplaceable amphibious experience from the Pacific, was relieved in October 1944 amid friction with Bradley's headquarters. His experience had been ignored before Omaha Beach. His relief came after months of being, in the words of the historical record, unsupported and dismissed. Courtney Hodges, who commanded 1st Army and presided over the Hurtgen Forest disaster, 33,000 American casualties in 50 square miles of forest where every American advantage was negated, was praised publicly by Bradley as one of the most skilled craftsmen in the entire command. Hodges was quiet. Hodges was deferential. Hodges fit. The pattern is not subtle once you see it. The commanders who produced results but did not fit the institutional model were halted, sidelined, or relieved. The commanders who fit the model were protected regardless of results. And the institutional model that Bradley enforced was not designed around winning battles. It was designed around managing relationships, controlling narratives, and ensuring that the command hierarchy remained legible and comfortable to the man at its center. Haislip survived the Falaise decision with his career intact. He was not relieved. He continued to command 15th Corps with distinction. But the moment that should have defined his reputation, the drive from Le Mans to Argentan, the gap that was 20 miles from closing, was absorbed into the broader narrative of Allied advance, attributed to the strategic architecture rather than the man who executed it, and filed in the section of the official history reserved for things that almost happened.
The officers who served in 15 Corps during the summer of 1944 left a record. It is not a loud record. It does not contain the kind of public contestation that would have been professionally fatal, but it is consistent. Across memoirs, after-action interviews, and the private correspondence of men who had been there, the picture that emerges is of a corps that knew what it had been positioned to accomplish and understood with precise professional clarity what the halt order had cost. One staff officer, writing privately decades after the war, described the afternoon of the 13th of August as the day the war got longer. He did not mean it rhetorically. He meant it as a military professional assessing, in hindsight, the operational consequence of a single command decision. The war got longer. More men died in the months that followed than would have died if the gap had been closed. That was his assessment, stated quietly in a letter not intended for publication to a colleague who had also been there. These men did not go public. They did not write op-eds or give interviews that contradicted the official account. They had grown up inside the institution, and they understood what the institution did to officers who broke ranks on decisions made by men who outranked them. They filed their assessments in the appropriate channels, received their decorations through proper procedures, and carried the knowledge of what had almost happened in the same breast pockets where other men carried photographs of their families. The cost of that silence was not paid by them. It was paid by the men who fought through the Hurtgen forest in the autumn, and the men who held the line in the Ardennes in December, and the families of every soldier who did not come home in the winter of 1944, when the summer of 1944 had briefly, absolutely offered the possibility that he might.
Patton's diary entry for the 13th of August, 1944, is not the entry of a man who accepted the halt order as reasonable. It is the entry of a man who understood, in real time, what was being lost. He wrote that Bradley had halted 15 Corps at a moment when continuing would have been the most decisive act of the entire campaign. He wrote that the decision reflected a fundamental difference in command philosophy, the difference between a commander who saw opportunity and moved to seize it, and a commander who saw risk and moved to contain it. He was not wrong, and he knew he was not wrong. And he also knew that being right in an institution that valued manageability over brilliance was not sufficient protection against the consequences of saying so too loudly. Patton said it anyway, in his diary, in the private record that he knew would outlast the official one. He said it because he was constitutionally incapable of silence on a question he considered a matter of professional truth, and because he understood, with the same clarity that governed his operational thinking, that if no one said it, the lesson would be buried with the decision. It was buried anyway. The diary was edited before publication. The most pointed assessments were softened or removed by the family members and military historians who controlled access to the papers. What survived was enough to understand what Patton thought. What was removed was enough to understand that someone thought it better if he had not thought it.
Wade Haislip retired from the Army in 1951. He rose to Vice Chief of Staff, a position of genuine institutional authority, recognition of a career that had been, by any objective measure, exceptional. His name appears in the index of every serious history of the Normandy campaign. His 15 Corps is mentioned in every account of the Falaise battle. But he is not the name people remember. He is not the face on the thumbnail, the subject of the documentary, the general whose story gets told when someone wants to explain what happened in France in the summer of 1944. The men who remember him are military historians who study the operational details that the popular narrative skips. And what those historians conclude, consistently, is that the drive from Le Mans to Argentan was among the most operationally brilliant sustained advances of the entire Western campaign, and that the halt order was among the most consequential missed opportunities of the war. There is a particular kind of injustice that does not destroy a man. It simply ensures that his most important contribution is never fully understood. Haislip was not broken by the Falaise decision. He was not relieved, not sidelined, not treated the way Terry Allen was treated. He continued to serve with distinction. By the conventional measures of a military career, he succeeded. But the moment that should have defined him, the morning when the gap was 20 miles wide and the German armies were inside it and 15 Corps was moving north with everything it had, that moment does not belong to him in the public record. It belongs to the strategic narrative, to the broad picture, to the men who sat in headquarters buildings and made the decision that stopped him. Wars are won and lost by men on the ground making decisions in real time, with incomplete information and no guarantee of outcome. The institutions those men serve are not designed to remember that. They are designed to remember the architecture, the broad strategy, the coordinated advance, the supreme commander's vision. The man who drove 300 miles in 3 weeks and arrived at the edge of the greatest encirclement of the Western campaign is a detail, a footnote, a mechanism in the machine. His name was Wade Haislip. He was Patton's best corps commander. He was winning. And the question that the official history has never answered, not in the memoirs, not in the communiques, not in the photograph taken when it was all over, is simply this: what would the map of Europe have looked like in the winter of 1944 if the phone had not rung on the 13th of August? We know what it looked like when it did.